Okay, so now you have spent some time learning about conformity, learning about obedience, and the power of roles. These are all things that are situational influences on human beings, right? And the power of the situation. So we're going to talk a little more about how groups influence us, intentionally or unintentionally. So does the presence of others, or how do others impact our behavior? So first we're going to talk about social facilitation and social inhibition. So social facilitation is something that happens when the presence of others improves our performance. This is something that occurs when the task is easy or well learned. So Michael Jordan performs better under conditions where there are hundreds of thousands of people watching him shoot a three-pointer, whereas I would probably perform much worse when there's thousands of people watching me. Okay, so social inhibition is what I would have been experiencing. Social inhibition is when the presence of others hinders our performance. Usually this occurs when the task is difficult or we are not used to performing the task, okay? And the reason that these two things happen is because of the physiological arousal that we feel when other people are around. So remember we talked about this a little bit in motivation. And so we know that performance level is related to your level of arousal. So if you are too hopped up, if you are out of control, you have testing anxiety, then performing a difficult task like taking a test is going to be much worse. Okay? Now, if you're doing an easy task, your level of arousal for peak performance is actually much higher. So that arousal caused by people being around can actually cause you to perform better. So again, social facilitation happens when the presence of others makes you perform better. Social inhibition happens when the presence of others makes you perform worse. Now, when you're within a group and people aren't watching you, what can happen is the diffusion of responsibility. Okay, this is why you guys all hate doing group projects, right? Because if you're in the group, you've got less individual responsibility for that project, okay? Diffusion of responsibility underlies several other constructs that we're going to talk about, okay? So social loafing is the first. The bystander effect, you're going to watch a video about, and then de-individuation. Okay, so diffusion of responsibility is exactly what it sounds like. The responsibility for whatever is happening is being diffused among multiple people, so no one is individually responsible. Okay, so let's first talk about social loafing. So during social loafing, this is when you're doing something as a group, you have pooled effort, okay, so you're all working together for the same goal, and therefore you exert less effort individually. This was actually demonstrated. This is not just a silly image, though I think it's funny, but they've actually demonstrated how social loafing works using a tug-of-war paradigm. So they put people on teams and see how much effort they exert in pulling the rope. When there's more people, they exert less effort individually, and that is social loafing. The next thing is de-individuation. Okay, so de-individuation is when you are experiencing an increased level of arousal. Remember that physiological arousal that happens when other people are around, and diminished responsibility at the same time. So you've got increased arousal, diminished responsibility, decreased levels of self-awareness and self-restraint, and these things can all lead to pretty poor behavior that you wouldn't see from individuals if they were the only ones around. So things like riots, big fights at major sporting events, those kinds of things, looting, those things happen as a result of de-individuation, right? So you have this huge group of people, they're basically anonymous because there's so many people, and so they demonstrate pretty terrible behavior. It's another reason that while you guys were in class with me, when there was 400 people, you guys experienced de-individuation as well. And you might have engaged, probably not because you guys are all great and wonderful, but sometimes people would engage in behaviors that you probably wouldn't have if we had been in a class of 15 or 25 and I knew your name. Because you have diminished responsibility, there's lots of people around, increased arousal, you have decreased self-awareness and self-restraint, you're willing to do things that aren't necessarily normal for you. Okay, so what about when groups argue? Group polarization. So when two groups argue about something, usually what happens is the groups actually become more polarized. Their opinions become more on far ends of the spectrum. So debates are not necessarily the greatest way or a good way at all to foster coordination or collaboration, because when the groups are arguing with one another, they're actually becoming more and more extreme in their opinions, and that's group polarization. That's one group process that happens through debate. When you're around people who have the same belief system as you, you also tend to have your belief system strengthened. Okay. Another thing that can happen in groups, and this is a little bit different. So group polarization happens when you have kind of two subgroups. Groupthink, on the other hand, happens when you have one group. And groupthink happens when you are engaged in a mode of thinking where you want to keep harmony in the group more than you want to raise a red flag if one exists. So you're not really necessarily thinking critically because you're more focused on keeping the group harmonious. So groupthink can drastically impair decision making, and large groups do tend to make extreme decisions to maintain group consensus. Okay, groupthink can happen when you have a particularly strong or charismatic leader, and in order to combat groupthink, it's always good to select a person in the group to play the role of a devil's advocate, someone who's going to say, I don't think this is a good idea, basically to everything, and make sure that you go through the realistic alternatives that exist.